On today's episode of Hungry for Wisdom, if you're going to gain wisdom, talk to somebody with more of it than you. Watch me work. It's episode 75. Turn it up! Special edition of Hungry for Wisdom today because what I did was got on the phone, or on Zoom, more accurately, with somebody who I run in the same circles with, but I've never actually spoken to her. She's good friends with good friends of mine and so on. Dr. Shannae Anderson is a clinical and forensic psychologist. She works a lot with trauma. She works a lot with children's psychology and things like that. And given where she is in life right now and in her profession, she'll tell you the story about, what has happened when she had her kind of violent clash, ideological clash with the hard left and the secularist movement and the child mutilation movement and things like that. Led her to where she is now, and she's getting to release some influence, which I think is really necessary and has been, because we need guides to deal with new ministry contexts, right? The world changes so quickly now. And what it takes to make disciples is kind of the answer to that question. What does it take to make disciples? That's sort of a shifting goalpost all the time now, because things are changing so fast and cultural philosophies develop so quickly and change so quickly. You know that thing where people are they're offended when you don't say something that is their brand new conviction, and then they pull up a clip where it's like, hey, 20 years ago, you didn't match up with this conviction that I've held for the last 5 minutes, so now you're immoral and we're going to cancel you. That's how fast things are moving now. And so for us to make disciples, represent Christ, and speak to the issues in the culture around us, we got to study a little bit, right? So it's important to touch base with people who are at the front end of communicating into this devil-ruled world so that we can pick up some tips from them. So anyway, I emailed her and said, hey, can we just sit down and talk? I got some questions as a pastor. And she was really clear with me. She's like, yo, I am not a theologian. I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm just a gal that loves Jesus, and I've got expertise in certain areas. So I'm not going to, like, these are my words, not hers, but she kind of said, I'm not going to, exegete the text masterfully. What I'm going to do is tell you my perspective on things from a biblical worldview. I said, great. So we sat down and talked for an hour this morning. She's on the East Coast, so it was 6 a.m. my time. I was under-caffeinated in this conversation, at least the first half of it. And I was trying to get her to, I'm just going to tell you this by way of setup before you listen to the whole thing. I was trying to get her to speak in a psychologist's terms, and I realized she was actually kind of reluctant to do that at the beginning. She was saying things like, well, that's more of a philosophy question than my area of expertise, but here's my opinion on it and things like that. And she didn't want to speak so much as a professional. When I was kind of wondering, like, why is she hesitant to do that? And then I think I got a beat on it, and I don't want to speak for her, but I think I figured it out, where she was trying to speak as a Christian, just a normal Christian. She was trying to equip average Joe Christian without a psychology degree and decades of practice in clinical assistance to people and counseling and things like that. She was trying to speak in language that we can understand and replicate. So I was like, thank you. And then at the end, the last 20 minutes of this, she really kind of kicked into professional gear as far as like, hey, here's what's happening in the brain that leads to this and that other stuff. So we wandered all over the place here. We talked about Bible, we talked about culture, we talked about psychology, we talked about philosophy, we talked about cultural exegesis and the judgment of God. We talked a little bit about eschatology, and something that I want you mature Christians to pay attention to here is that she's coming from a very specific eschatological worldview. She's got kind of the Calvary Chapel dispensational background, right? So they are much more prone to say things like, okay, we're getting close and this whole thing's about to stop. Like, Jesus is coming back any day now. She's much more prone to say something like that than maybe somebody from the camp that me and Pastor Ben are members of. I don't know. That makes it sound so formal. We would say things like, we hope Jesus is coming back soon. We pray for the quick return of Jesus, but we also need to think in terms of what are our grandkids going to be inheriting, right? And so you can see that when I say, hey, what do we need to know for the generations down the road? Her answer is, well, we're getting close, right? And so she didn't say, like, don't worry about it, it doesn't matter. I don't think she would ever say that. She cares about kids and grandkids, obviously. She's investing her life in them. But it's interesting. You get to see here where our eschatology really does play a role in our current engagement. So I very much appreciated her explanation of all this stuff. You can see kind of where we part ways and where we push back on each other and things like that. A great conversation with a great sister. I'm very appreciative. Let's listen up, and I hope I hope you all learned something, because I did. It is an early morning, actually, especially over here on the west side, but not so much for you. But you carved out time. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you getting up so early to match me on my East Coast time.
It works out great. I got my coffee pot right here, so I can get a refill anytime.
Perfect.
Anytime we're talking here. If I could, Dr. Anderson, why don't you just could I just ask you to give us kind of a quick rundown of what got you out there on the East Coast to begin with? Because this is a story that I think people need to hear just for awareness of what's happening.
Yeah, it is. I don't know if I can do it briefly, but I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm a licensed psychologist in California and now in Virginia. And I originally started speaking publicly about 3 years ago. It was in April 2020 during the lockdowns. And in Southern California, they were draconian. They were shutting down the churches and the schools and keeping open the weed dispensaries and the liquor stores. And so I was attending a church that was being very vocal about it. And so, about a month into the lockdowns, I started speaking out about the potential mental health consequences that we were going to see as a result of the lockdown. And sadly, I think it was a bit prophetic, because we are now enduring the most serious mental health consequences I think that our country has ever seen. We've seen an increase in depression and anxiety and trauma and PTSD and drug and alcohol use and overdose. I mean, I can go on and on. But as a result of that, I started to get attacked. I was deplatformed on all my social media. I was canceled. FBI contacted me to let me know that I was on an Antifa hit list. But by God's amazing strength and power, he kept me speaking. And I started speaking across the nation, all up and down California. And then last year, I was asked to speak at a school board meeting back in my hometown of Thousand Oaks, where a third grade teacher had shown a transgender video to her third grade students without telling the parents, getting their okay or anything. And so it kind of created quite a stir in town. So I spoke out at a school board meeting talking about how inappropriate it is to be teaching transgender education to these small children. And through my talk at the school board, I was booed, hissed, called a hater throughout. It was really unpleasant. But what ended up happening was, a week later, I received an email from a friend of mine who is a city councilman. And he said that he had actually received a copy of a 51-paged complaint against my license. And so he sent me a copy, and it was put together by a transgender activist in town who was working in concert with the school board. She, in this complaint, called me a white supremacist, called me transphobe, said that
you got to go white supremacist. That's wrong number one of I don't like you. Yeah.
Oh, but what was even better is that she had a picture of me speaking, and I guess I somehow put up a white supremacist sign. It was unbelievable.
There's a lot of new white supremacy signs coming out that I don't know about. I'm like, oh wow, I do that when I'm picking up a cup of coffee. I didn't know that was a white supremacist.
Right? She said I was such a threat that doing therapy with me would violate individual civil rights, that doing therapy with me would guarantee someone's death, that I was a threat not only to those in the school district, but also to those in the city, as well as the entire county. So millions of people, that I was such a danger to. And not only did she send this to my board, which puts my license and my entire livelihood at risk, she also forwarded it to my state representative, my United States representative, the entire city council, the school board superintendent, and the city attorney, in an attempt to defame me, to shut me down, to silence me. And it was devastating. I was horrified and shocked that this had happened. But after much prayer and support from my pastor and my friends, A friend of mine actually said, Shannae, if you do not go back to the next meeting tonight and call them out on this, and if you don't keep talking about this, they win. So that night, I went back to call the school board members out on how they were endorsing and supporting this individual. And I actually called them now the haters because I wasn't hating on anybody. They were now hating on me. And it was the final school board meeting of the year. There were about 500 protesters there, including a number of Antifa media, walking through this gauntlet of talk about haters screaming and yelling. It required 3 bodyguards to get me just into the building. And when I shared my testimony, by God's grace, a number of people from my church had shown up to support me, which was wonderful. My husband was with me. A lot of friends were with me. But when I left, they had people strategically placed in the parking lot. What they try to do is dox you once you speak out against the school board. And so I had a number of people follow me. Again, had to have 5 bodyguards at this point in time. A woman tried to run us down in her car. My husband and I had to run to our car. We got on the freeway. We were followed. We had to call the police.
And all this because you said that exposing kids to sexual deviancy is a negative experience for them.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
that's it. And trying to kill me, dox me. But what has happened subsequent to that is, Antifa back on me once again. But I also started to receive phone calls that I believe are erroneous patient requests to set me up that are asking for non-affirmative gender care because in California you must give that affirmative care for anybody who's dealing with any of those sexual identity gender issues, and this isn't even a specialty of mine. And so I didn't even understand what they were asking. And then the Lord really spoke to me and said, Shannae, this is a setup. They're trying to set you up, send you a fraudulent patient so then they can even further go after your license. So it was really overwhelming. Again, Antifa took to Twitter and was defaming me across the country. But we know what Satan tries to use for evil, God will use for good. I had been connected to the American Association of Christian Counselors, speaking at a number of their conferences for at least the last decade. And I was speaking with some of the individuals who work for AACC, and they had shared that they had started an ethics and advocacy division and that they were trying to fight for religious liberty for Christian counselors because we are facing an existential threat. So God used this to offer me a job. My husband and I were dying to get out of California, to flee Comrade Mussolini, as my pastor in California calls him. But we were in the fight in California. And so we were really waiting for the Lord to release us. And he did. We moved cross country to Virginia, where I am now the co-director of ethics and advocacy and the director of psychology with the American Association of Christian Counselors. And I start teaching at Liberty University in the fall. And so Good. God is using me to speak up on this issue of how the state is trying to remove Christian counselors from the game completely. They do not believe as Christians that we should even be in the field of psychology or counseling because our values contradict the agenda that they are trying to push. And so I know I am not the only one that has had these complaints, that has had these issues. We get calls a lot from other Christian counselors talking about this. And our goal is to really fight this. We're putting together a document that we're hoping we can submit to Congress, to a lot of big people in the country, because they're trying to take away accreditations in graduate programs that are training Christian counselors. They're going after licenses. They're going, after accrediting bodies are trying to take everything away from us. And it's just wrong.
Yeah, it's the basic Marxist play, right? There's a proposition of who is God, and it's not a supernatural God, it's a governmental God, and all other gods must be crushed, because that's the nature of divine warfare, is that one god has to win and the other one has to be wiped out, which I think is maybe where you get this animal instinct to see somebody that you disagree with and just kill them, right? Just take away their livelihood, follow them on the freeway, put them on hit lists, and so on. It's a very all or nothing type of thing, which for average Joe Christian is kind of a strange way of thinking, because we think in terms of like, all right, Jesus said, love your neighbor. Sometimes that's hard and sometimes I fail. How could I do that better and differently? And when we're called out on it, we, in our more sane moments, we agree and we say, yeah, you're right, I should do differently. That line of thinking doesn't exist when you're competing for God status, right?
Well, we have a God that is a God of truth. He is a God of mercy and a God of grace. What I think is going on is I think these crazy ideas are rooted in a God made in their own image, that it is a man God, that it is narcissism at its peak. And it has almost become a cultish religion that is based on feelings.
Yeah, I've
And
said this many times. Like, I recognize religious fervor, right? I am something of a religious radical. I follow a guy that I claim was raised from the dead and is still in active communication with me from 2,000 years ago. Like, that's a pretty radical claim, right? And I recognize crazy religious people when I see one, because I look at one in the mirror every morning and I'm like, I'm looking at a religion right now. That's what that is.
Yes.
Don't tell me you're a secularist. I'm not buying it. Yeah. But I wonder if maybe, and this probably isn't even worth saying, but I'm just going to give it a shot because I can edit this video later. I wonder if maybe we, in the push for secularization, we tried to make God the better version of ourselves, like the ideal version of us, the Ubermensch, right? To in philosophical terms. And it just wasn't possible. And it just ended up with fields full of dead bodies all the time. And so what we did was we just lowered that standard to not even be, our God wasn't even a better version of ourselves. It's just whatever we happen to be at the moment. I'm just going to worship that. And it ends up being actually, I think, worse, because then there is no ideal. There's nothing to strive for, right? There's no hope in that. It's just, this is what it is, make it significant. And if anybody threatens your significance, now they got to move to Virginia.
Well, and it's so sad because they're so lost.
Yeah.
And if you really look at this cult of religion that we're speaking about, there is no hope. There is no joy. There is no peace. There is no truth. They are so lost. And it's heartbreaking because they are indoctrinating our youth with these lies. I mean, initially it started at the college level. Now they're starting in kindergarten. So the school board back in Thousand Oaks, California, the superintendent thought that what that third grade teacher did was fantastic. And they now instituted transgender education K through 12.
Yeah, this is child abuse in its purest form. I mean, I will train you to love me even at your own expense, right? Mm-hmm. To affirm my dysfunction, even if it kills you, you will love me. That's not even codependency. I don't know what the level is beyond that, but that's evil.
That's psychopathic. And
there you go. Thank you.
Yeah, there is no free will in that. That's totalitarian. And that, again, is 180 degrees from our God, who gives us free will, who wants us to love him and gives us free choice in that because he loves us, that he's not going to force us to do anything.
So here's where I want to go with you. There's kind of two tracks that I'd like to, kind of pick your brain on. One is, and they're related, they overlap. One is just the mental health crisis that we have entered into. It's been building for a long time. COVID blew it loose. And I want to kind of get your take on how that went, just so that people can get an understanding of our new ministry context, because it's not the same as it was 5-10 years ago. And then also related to that, there's this issue of just how do we approach it's too reductionistic to call it the transgender movement, but that whole ball of ideas, the sexual deviancy and the marring of the image of God that's being demanded to be celebrated. So how do we engage that without just checking out? Because it's a totally different language than Christians speak, and it's hard for us. So we need to be equipped for this. So let me cover this real quick. You are a clinical and forensic psychologist. Did I get the title right? Okay. Now, I think we pretty much understand what a clinical psychologist does. You meet with people, you help them out. Forensic psychology, give us a rundown of what that is.
Forensic basically just means is connected to the legal system.
Okay.
So there's forensic psychologist, a forensic accountant, anything that's tied in with laws and regulations like that. So what I do as a forensic psychologist is I often will get hired by defense attorneys, sometimes by DAs and prosecutors, to go in and to evaluate their clients for mental health issues and relay how that impacts either the commission of their crime, or it gets tied into sometimes sentencing issues and things like that. I think forensic psychology became a little well known during the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case when there were two forensic psychologists kind of going at each other in that case.
That
But
was
that's kind of
so
what I
weird. That must have been fascinating for you to watch. Just like what
it
what
really
circus,
was.
what psychological circus is unfolding in front of me here?
It really, and it's funny because I really didn't want to have anything to do with it. And this sounds crazy, but I really felt like the Lord's like, Shannae, turn it on. I want you to watch it. And as soon as I turned it on, it was the part with the forensic psychologist. I'm like, oh, okay, Lord, this is interesting. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thanks for engaging in that because people were telling me about it and I was like, I just can't get there, guys. I got a million kids. We got to make disciples. Like this is not interesting to me. I'll watch the guy play a pirate, but I did understand that there was something culturally significant happening there, and I never got a beat on what it was. And it's representative of the whole somehow, where it's like you had somebody saying, "This is my truth," and then you've got this "Believe All Women" movement, and it came up against this point where you just can't, and then you're forced to agree with a guy that really is a pretty distasteful character, and you don't really have an interest in defending. But some stuff is true and some stuff is not, and that came to light in a world that's not supposed to affirm that paradigm at all. And so it's sort of like this is a really weird test
Well,
case.
I think, but it speaks to the dogmatic ruling that I think is going across the country right now that is associated with feminism, that is associated with victimization, that you are not to ever question. That if a woman says, I was raped, I was sexually assaulted, I was harmed, that by nature of her being a female, you should never question.
Mm-hmm.
And, I grew up in, the 70s and the 80s when feminism, I think, was a more healthy, equality driven feminism that, men and women have equal rights. And what feminism has turned in today is, I believe, kind of a Jezebel spirit that is really trying to destroy men and that is really trying to run everything. And so what happened in that case is we were being confronted with victimization, that we're being told that we have to believe. And we were also being confronted with somebody that had a very severe personality disorder and really was not speaking the truth. And so it was a game changer for our culture.
So leading up to that then, or leading up to that point and where we are now, you mentioned, the philosophical shift in feminism from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into today. There's been a lot of philosophical shifts, and it's hard to track these things in real time because we don't understand it a lot of times until we look back in history and we can kind of analyze the data set. But I want to see if I can get some clarity on what has happened with some of these philosophical shifts. So, for example, victimhood has become a virtue, right? And that's different. That's new. A quick story. I was down at a transgender, no, a drag show rally, because on Resurrection Sunday they had the Easter drag show, and we were like, yeah, we're going. This is our day. We're going, and this is that was just, it was combative of that community to do that on a Christian holiday. So I was like, all right, we're gonna go share the gospel with some people. And really, I mean, we're a little bit sarcastic around here, so it's like we're gonna get revenge on the devil by saving some drag queens while they're in drag. That's what we're gonna do. I love it. It was almost fun. But I'm down there talking to this kid, 21, and he said, I was raised in church. And now I know the church he was raised in. I know a lot of the guys over there. It's right across town. And he said, as soon as they found out that I struggled with my sexuality, we were on a youth retreat, and when I was 15. So now this is only 6 years ago. I know all the guys that were there, right? He says, I was 15 and they beat me with a bag of Bibles. And I'm thinking, first off, I've never seen a bag full of Bibles before. They come in boxes. Like what kind of scenario led up to? Yeah, he said they beat him with a bag. His youth pastor beat him with a bag of Bibles at a camp retreat. And so I'm thinking about it. I'm like, I know the guy. That scenario seems weird. And then I realized this never happened. What's happening is he needs a victim origin story in order to gain entry into this community. And so I'm sure that somebody probably said some inappropriate stuff to him. Boys will be boys, and there was probably some things there that needed to be, repented of and maybe disciplined in real time. But
Right.
you have to have your card stamped in order to gain points in the community. So that got me thinking, like, what is that shift that happened where victimhood has become a virtue? What led to that?
Um, this is just my opinion. And again, mind you, I'm a psychologist. I'm not a philosophist or philosopher. I'm not, that whole world is not my world. But I hate to throw my own profession under the bus, but I do think it is my profession. I think it is the I don't even know if there's a word here, a psychologization of the culture. And I've been practicing since, my goodness, I saw my very first patient in 1989. And back then, there was not any acknowledgement at all in the culture about mental illness. And I do think that it has been a really good thing that we've had advocates out there educating our society about mental illness. But I think it has come with this sad component of it excuses behavior. I think there are a lot of therapists that I'm going to get myself in trouble here. I've taught in graduate programs of psychology, and I think a lot of the clinicians that are being churned out, especially at the master's level, are not anything I would even bring in to counsel my cat. I think a lot of people can get a 2-year master's in counseling and start launching into helping others when either they've never addressed their own work themselves and they just, in a sense, affirm. And you see this in the role of how you see therapists played in movies of, and how do you feel about that? And how do you feel about that? That it's all usually emotion driven and that feelings are facts. And so I think this started bubbling in the 90s as mental illness and different mental disorders were being acknowledged. You then throw in the advent of social media that I think has ramped up everything across the board, that if you want to get any form of attention, you have to be really cutting edge on social media. And if you're not looking like a Kardashian, and if you're not living that lifestyle, which who can, so they're creating all these filters so people can look fabulous. But if you don't fit into that niche, you have to find something else. And that's where I think a lot of people, especially teenagers, are unhappy. They're lost. We know as we've taken God out of schools, we've taken prayer out of schools. Faith is decreasing in our world. And I believe it's being replaced by psychology. People are then holding on to their truth. And that concept is a psychological phenomenon of recognize that, yes, you can have your own experience and your own experience may be valuable and valid for you. But the piece that's been missing, I believe, in psychological circles is that that does not equal truth. That your truth is your truth, in a sense, your opinion is your opinion, your experience is your opinion. But they have stolen the word truth from Christianity, that now your truth equals the truth.
Right. So, like, if somebody comes into me as their pastor, and I'm doing some pastoral counseling, right? And they say, my father was abusive, and that's where all of this is stemming from. And I get to the bottom of it and realize their father was not actually abusive, right? There's something else going on here. Now, this happens. So in some sense, perception is reality. You have to deal with this person on the basis of what they're telling you, because those are, because you have to navigate that, right? You can't just invalidate them and say, well, you're crazy, and I'm going to download my perspective on you. That's abuse right there, right?
Right,
but,
exactly.
Yeah. So perception is reality to a certain degree, but that's like it's almost like a stepping stone to getting to the ultimate truth. So what you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, is perception is reality does not equal ultimate truth. We don't have to have one turn into the other.
Exactly. But I think that is what's happened. For example, even the diagnosis of PTSD, which, first became a diagnosis in 1980. And the first, it was called Criterion A, was really addressing the objective nature of trauma that you had to have, that you had to experience, that would lead to PTSD. It had to be something that was life threatening. It had to be something that almost anybody would find to be traumatic.
Okay.
Well, when they came out with the most latest edition of the DSM-5, they've now removed that to where now it's whatever you perceive to be traumatic is traumatic. And because trauma is my specialty, I see exactly what you're talking about all the time. I will work with people who have had legitimate trauma of, sexual abuse for decades, or surviving mass shootings, things like that. But then I also have these people that will come to me saying, oh my gosh, I'm so traumatized because, of these things that maybe were not pleasant, but they don't go by our traditional definition of trauma. And so you're right. I want to validate that individual's experience, but that's where I think things get stuck, is that if you're saying you feel like a victim, I can validate, yes, I hear that you feel like a victim, but let's look at what that is really about for you. Mm-hmm. Why might you be taking on this victim role? And I regularly will challenge that with my patients, because as I've been working in this field for over 30 years, I will tell my patients, like, I don't want you to be a victim. You're not a victim.
That's contrary to Romans 8. Christ has made you X, yes. and the Holy Spirit indwelling you makes you X. You're claiming to be Y. Fine, let's move you over here so that you can conform with what God says is true about you.
You are an overcomer in Christ. You are not a worldly victim. And that is my goal with them, is to really get them to shift their idea or their identity out of that victim stance and really into a place of recognizing we're all going to experience trials. I'm a trauma survivor myself. And I know I slipped into that victim state temporarily before I was able to really launch into being an overcomer and really getting my identity in Christ. It's very easy to get stuck in that because it validates your feelings. But feelings are not facts. And this is something I tell my patients regularly. You may feel one way, but that doesn't establish the truth about it.
Yeah. So my ultimate question here is why? Like, why did that catch on? So I was reading Isaiah 3, and he says, okay, Israel, here's your judgment. You will be ruled by women and children. And I see, I mean, it was kind of a joke to me when, during some of these elections, you get some of the most immature people in the world running against women. And I'm like, oh, okay, so my choices are women or children. Great. Like, welcome to the judgment, right? So but on a more serious note, though, we're now legislating that the whims of children become law. So, for example, and you saw this in California before, but I'm in Washington, and so we've got these laws now that if a kid says, I feel like the opposite gender, like you said, you have to affirm them legally. So the whims of children are now governing the behavior of adults. And it's like, okay, so we're there. God saw this coming. This is not new. We're there. But my question is, why? Like, I have not, this might sound simplistic, but I have not been able to pin down a motivation for a grown man or a grown woman advocating for something like this that is so clearly, I mean, I thought clearly unloving. I mean, kids don't get to pick their own nutritional, habits. Like, what are we doing?
Pick their own bedtime.
Yeah, so it's obviously insane. My question is, what's the motivation behind it? Other than just, I mean, I can explain it from the spiritual side, but on the human side, what is it?
I really do think it's a spiritual battle. I
Sure.
really do think that is what is going on. And I think that Satan has an agenda, and I think his time is close. I think we're in end times. Times are getting darker. And I think that Satan is doing everything he can to break down the family, to break down children, to make everything conform in his image of evil. But I do think it goes back, I think, to the breakdown in our country. I mean, if you remember, our country was founded on Christian values. We were founded on the church. And when you take God out of the society that it was rooted on, and like you're talking about cultural Marxism, something has to take its place. When you take God out of the classroom, when you take God out of things, the self replaces it. And so we now have no fault divorce. We now have abortion on command. It has become a world of me first. I mean, we know the human heart is desperately wicked. And I think that that is what has happened, that we've gotten more and more wicked. But I also think, and to not sound too much like a conspiracy theorist, the goal is pedophilia.
I agree with
That
you, by the way.
really,
You can, hey, us put on our tinfoil hats and we're just going to talk
okay.
for a second because yeah, this is not even up for debate in my mind anymore.
Okay, good. We've got the World Economic Forum who is trying to create a one world government, which we know is going to happen before Jesus comes back. And to do that, they have to destroy both the United States and Israel because we are the ones that hold tight to God, to the Christian and Jewish God. You know what I'm saying? I'm probably
Yep.
feel I messed that up. But, and so what I think is happening is that they have to destroy the family. And they've done this by, again, the no fault divorce, by over empowering women, demeaning men, creating social media that just propagandizes children and teenagers. They legalize marijuana so everybody is high and it's not going to fight back. And they really are trying to destroy children because that's the future. I mean, if you look at what Hitler did in Germany, went after the Hitler Youth. It's just like what they're doing now. If we can indoctrinate the young children, that is going to set up what our future goal is of a one world government, a one world secular society where the self and perhaps AI is God, where it's do what thou wilt. And
Yeah,
we're
just for
well.
the listening audience here, that reference is the Satanic Bible. So the opening line of the Satanic Bible, Yankee Rose, I think it's called, right, is "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Which, of course, they got to put it in King James English to make it sound holy, because Satan's a loser. But he's like super creative, buddy. But yeah, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." So, in more modern terms, Fleetwood Mac sings, "You can go your own way." That's what that is. Like, do your thing,
And
or
do whatever you want.
yeah,
Do whatever you want.
it's your
Because you're
thing.
your
Do
own
what you want
God.
to do. Yeah, yeah. So okay, the the breakdown, or the predatory nature of this movement towards children specifically. I think there's also that element where innocence is repulsive to the devil and any satanic line of thinking, right? To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are impure, nothing is pure. It's all defiled. And it's just like there's just kind of this nasty taste that innocence and that kind of beauty leaves in the mouth of evil. So you got to go after the kids, right? Here's where I want to get you talking. You've got a statement that I heard you make one time, that our response to COVID, the lockdowns, the top down pressure, the like gaslighting being the new norm of public interaction. Like, that's just, we talk in gaslighting terms now. It's all we do. That COVID really broke a lot of that loose and accelerated it, but that was already being pressurized, right?
Yeah.
And I've heard you talk about this. I'd like to get you explaining that a little bit more so that people can kind of understand why all of our public discourse seems so unhealthy right now. What led up to that? Because it wasn't COVID.
You're right. You're right. I think, again, it's been going on, I would say maybe it's been going on, I think perhaps for about 100 years, but it really accelerated, I think, in the last 20 or so. And the gaslighting is really denying your reality. It's denying truth. It's making you feel crazy. It's doublespeak. It's 1984.
Let me define this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to cut you off there. I just realized I threw out a term that may not be widely known to people. So you can define this better than I can. But essentially, like, gaslighting is when you make the other person think that they're crazy, even when, like, you're pulling a fast one and you make them think that it's them that's on solid ground, right?
Well, and they do that by denying reality. And
Okay.
sadly, we as parents do this to our children, sadly, a lot. When, let's say, mom and dad are in a fight, child comes out and says, "Mommy, Daddy, what's going on? Are you guys fighting?" And mom and dad say, "No, no, no, we're not fighting." That's gaslighting.
Okay.
The child knows something is going on, but the parents are saying, don't trust what you see, what you hear. Don't trust your own experience because it's wrong.
Okay.
And so what happens is when you regularly gaslight people, and this happens in a lot of abusive families, alcoholic families, dysfunctional families, where denial reigns, and they don't want you to point out that there's this giant elephant in the living room. And so they're going to deny your reality. And if they start doing this again when you're young, you base your whole reality, identity, how you think, how you perceive on the authority figures in your life. And as a child, that's going to be your parents. The authority figures in our life in society are those that are in the government, represented by the state, all the authority figures. And if they tell you that, in fact, what you're seeing isn't real, you start to question yourself because by nature they have authority over you. You're going to give them more credence. And so you start to question yourself. So when they're saying that there is this deadly virus that is going to kill, that's killing everybody, that you can't see grandma, you have to wear a mask. We've known for 100 years that masks are ineffective against viruses, but yet we have to wear one. We can't leave our house. We can't do anything that we once normally did, or we're going to kill someone. But then you start looking at the data, and how does that make sense that less than 1% of the population was dying of this virus? And the other piece that I've spoken about, especially during COVID, is part of their agenda is if they can frighten you, you won't be thinking out of the highest part of your brain. You have to understand you have your neocortex, which is really that thinking part of your brain. It goes completely offline. It's like turning a light switch off when you are in a state of fear. When you're operating out of fear, it's the middle part of your brain. It's operating out of the amygdala. It's really kind of a fight, flight, freeze reaction. And we were forced to freeze in our house. Very few of us fought back. You really couldn't flee anywhere. And so most people complied, which is another F. There's fight, flee, freeze, and fawn. Fawning is when you become obsequious and give in to your perpetrator with the hope that it will be better for you. And so that's where people would wear the mask for the virtue signaling. That's when, people would scream at each other if they weren't wearing the mask, or if they were out, or if they weren't standing 6 feet apart, because you're operating from this place of fear. It is as if your IQ has dropped 50%. You cannot think. So when you introduce something that is frightening to the culture, it makes it much easier to gaslight them because they're not thinking with their higher thoughts. So that's why I actually predicted eerily after the lockdown, the summer of 2020, how everything, when all the riots began, because you lock people in their homes. For some people, you're locking them in there with their perpetrators. Think about it. We know child abuse increased. We know domestic violence increased. We know all of the risk factors for both of those forms of trauma were there. We've got people losing jobs, no
and the
social
drug
support.
abuse because guys couldn't go to rehab. I mean, I'm
alcohol.
Yeah, we start talking like this, and people will tell me, and honestly, like good folks with the best of intentions, they'll tell me, look, we lost family members. You can say this, that it wasn't a big deal all you want, but people were dying. And I say, I know, I'm a pastor. I was the one doing the funerals. But what I know that the hospitals don't know is that I did just as many funerals for people who died from isolation causes as people who died from COVID. It was in the proportions are not even close, but that doesn't show up in the medical data because it happened off campus, Well,
but we do know that more teens and young adults died of overdoses and suicides than they did of COVID. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think what made COVID just really the big game changer is when you have people running off of fear and you gaslight them by telling them, no, this is not a riot. Buildings are burning in the back. This is just a peaceful protest. No, George Floyd was a good guy, even though, he's got this record and was a drug addict. And people will believe the mainstream media because they're operating out of fear.
Well, and this was a weird case because at the beginning, honestly, and this is me being charitable, I really believe what I'm saying, but I think it's also important to say this if if you think it's true. At the beginning, we really didn't know what we were dealing with,
Exactly.
and and so there was a maybe this might be stating it too strongly, but a legitimate fear of the unknown.
I
And
agree.
I'm no fan of our governor in this state. He but I realized that he was probably dealing with more high quality information than I could get my hands on at the time. And so it was like, all right, let's roll with it, see what happens, right? And then after you see, for me, it wasn't even my perspective on this started turning when I realized they're not dealing with science anymore. They're these guys are enjoying the power grab. And then so now you got two issues. You got to evaluate the science and the actual situation. And then you got to realize that regardless of what that says, there's evil that's actually happening here. So that became a very tricky thing for all of us to navigate. And you can
Right.
give a lot of guys some grace on making the decisions that are opposite of what you would have made. And I think that's a charitable thing to do. That being said, now, and I'm sure you've seen this, you're a relentless researcher, right? I listen to you talk and I'm like, this girl's got her facts. But now you're seeing these guys that were the perpetrators, to use your term. I think it's a good one, that were the perpetrators saying, well, we got some stuff wrong, but we can't get everything right. We're scientists, so give us some grace. I actually heard an interview with Richard Dawkins saying, give me grace. And I'm like,
Really?
no,
He
you
doesn't
claim
even
to be,
believe in grace.
yeah, I'm like, you claim to be God. God doesn't get grace. God has to be perfect. And so I say no. What was that? Who was it that advocated for a COVID amnesty? It was like, hey, we got it wrong, but was that the
Yes,
Atlantic?
I saw that. I don't remember who that was, but yes, I remember hearing
I
that.
laughed out loud. I'm like,
So did
no,
I.
you spent the last 3 years calling my church members and my family members murderers for sneezing in public. You know, you can. How about, I'll accept your apology. That's where I'll meet you. I'll accept your apology. That's very different than, hey man, que sera sera, whatever. It was a weird time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I keep coming back to though is that there were preconditions that made that possible, right? Like 1774, I think it was. We were shooting people over a 2% T tax, and now we're saying, okay, you can have my livelihood and dictate what happens in my home. There's a shift there that didn't happen in 2020. What makes that make sense to us?
And that's where my pastor talked on this in one of his sermons, and I'm going to completely butcher it because I'm not a social scientist. But there is a theoretician who has spoken about what happens to countries when they have excessive wealth and when God has blessed them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what has happened to our country is, we were at the top and we took it for granted. I think we've been complacent. And I think I know, I'm now a grandmother, but when my son was young, I know I wholeheartedly trusted the school board, trusted what was being taught in his classroom. That is my bad that I
Mm.
have to repent of. And that is something that I think we became complacent. I think that we were enjoying, our $1 million homes, racking up credit card debt. I think we slowly gave into our fleshly desires. I think that we wanted what we wanted, and we allowed the state to slowly creep in. I think it came in, I remember actually when it came in the 90s, when I was in graduate school and the beginning of the postmodern movement. And I think that was the slow breakdown. And I think sadly, we as a people are to blame. And you may not like this, but I think the church is to blame. I think the church stepped out of the political sphere ages ago. And again, this is something my pastor in California regularly says. I'm a part of a Calvary Chapel church. And the new movie, that came out, the Greg Laurie story of the Jesus Revolution, there have been, a massive explosion in Calvary Chapel churches throughout California and throughout the world. But as that has been exploding, California has been the heart. We are the ones under Governor Reagan at the time that instituted no fault divorce. We have been one of the capitals of abortion. We are now, sanctioning, the murder of children 28 days after they've been born. They're now still calling that abortion. They're wanting to take children out of parents' homes if the parents disagree with their transgender, decision. California has been on the forefront of decimating our country. And where has the church been? Why has the church not been speaking out about this? And I think, a lot of people, especially through COVID, were saying, well, listen to the government. What is it? The Romans 13 argument. But in the United States, we are the government. It is we, the people. We are the king. We are the magistrates. And we have shut up and we have stopped taking responsibility for our part in this country, especially as believers. We are the ones that are supposed to hold the country to its moral center. Where are we?
I think I might have a different take on that, because, and this might be context specific to what I'm seeing here. This isn't based on nationwide research or anything like that. What struck me as a purification, because we've been talking for a long time, for decades, about the weakness of the church, because it's kind of gotten, like you say, victims of our own success, right? There's big buildings, there's big overhead, there's comfortable jobs and things like that, and so when those kind of, I guess you could call them mainline efforts at spirituality, sort of emptied out under pressure, that struck me in a lot of ways as a positive thing, because the squishy middle evaporated, right? And right. I think a lot of times when Christianity is done well, it's done with a steadiness that may not be loud, but actually wins over the long haul. And so there were a lot of times during the lockdowns where it's like, okay, I really wish we were being more vocal about this. That being said, now 3 years on the other side of the initial cataclysm of that impact, 3.5 years, I guess. You're looking at this, and the churches that are biblically based are far healthier on average, I would say, than they were before. And the ones that were already wandering off of biblical authority or whatever have either died or are just pretending to be alive at this point. And I'm like, I think that's actually a net positive. And I don't know that it bodes well for the country, but we're at a point now where, we are enemies of God. Just by the numbers of babies that we've slaughtered. If you took just that metric alone, we are Psalm 2, right? So the country's best interest might not be the church's best interest anymore, and I think that the church was actually really well served by COVID in the long run. I didn't know that it was going to go that direction at all times, but I think it has. And so then there's a question of, what do we learn from this? And this is where I'm disturbed, is that it seems like things in a lot of ways have gone back to normal. Like, okay, that was weird. Wow, that was really unpleasant. Let's get back to business. And it's like, did you people just see how much they enjoyed controlling our lives? You think this is the last time that's going to happen? They love this.
But also look at what is going on. I do think there is a dramatic schism going on right now in the church. I mean, if you look at what the Southern Baptist Convention just did, that they held up Rick Warren's expulsion for having a female teaching pastor. So I do think that the church, I agree with you. I think God is absolutely purifying the church. I think he's absolutely purifying his body right now. I think he has been for the last decade or so, because times are getting darker. But I also think that the church is being split. There are those that are taking up the Black Lives Matter, that are taking up the transgender ideology, and those that are, it is, you can no longer be lukewarm on some of these issues.
Yep.
I think it's no irony that we're talking in June and the whole pride stuff and what is going on. And that's where, I think churches, they have to make a choice.
Yep. Yeah. And praise God, I'm fine with it, because, I think the heretics have been one of the greatest gifts to the church, because it forces us to codify our doctrines. And so as these heresies pop up, it's like, good, we've seen this before. We have historical categories for how to handle this. We're gonna sacrifice. We're gonna get our teeth kicked in politically at times, and we're gonna articulate truth better than we've ever had to in our lifetime. And that's gonna wind up being a real spiritual boon, hopefully, for our kids. I just hope it happens in the lifetime of my kids.
Exactly.
Right. Which it may or may not.
I do want to say I really commend you for having this podcast because I do think, sadly, more people aren't talking about it and more people aren't speaking out about it. And you have a great platform, and my pastor has a great platform. But I want to say, I don't like public speaking. I am very conflict averse. I really do not like standing up and speaking out against things. That is not in my nature at all.
You want to help
And
people. You're a clinician. Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's why, before COVID, I was very happy in my little bubble of seeing my patients and just kind of doing my thing. But I do think God wants to raise up voices like mine to be able to speak about this. And that's when I always want to say, look, I'm not special. I'm not a gifted orator. This is the power of the Holy Spirit working in me and me just being obedient. And that I think more and more people need to do that because the left, whatever we want to talk about, the secular progressives, whatever it is, they own the mainstream media. They really have no accountability, and they're very angry and they're very vocal. And I think we need to begin to speak out more about what's going on, because I think a lot of people don't know that we can or that we should.
Well, I'm going to tell you something that I appreciate about your approach to this, and then I'm going to give you some warning because I'm going to ask you a big question. So here's the warning, and then you can think about it while I ramble for a second.
Okay.
What I'm going to ask you is where all this ends, because basically we've made mental illness the norm, and the question is what society are we heading into, and from a psychological perspective, how do you operate in an environment where everybody's mentally ill? Now, obviously, that's an overstatement, but maybe not by much, right? So I'd like to get your thoughts on just how to love your neighbor when everybody's got barriers between themselves and being able to accept a clear statement of fact. One thing that I appreciate about the fact that you've become one of the more influential people in the AACC world, which is a great world. I mean, we're all AACC, counselors around here at the church. I love what's going on there, what Tim and the guys are doing out there. In fact, well, never mind. I was about to talk about some people we both know and be like, hey, guess who I'm going to talk to later? It doesn't matter. But one thing I appreciate about your approach to this is there's, you're kind of giving people permission to just say some stuff that everybody knows is true. And right. I might be wrong about this. I think I see you working hard not to spend too much time speaking in clinical and professional language, because there is a conversation that needs to happen among the people with degrees that I can't pronounce. And that's, the academic conversations are very important. And that's the basis of a lot of stuff, right? Those determine the outcomes of those conversations, determine what happens in the next generation to a large degree, which is why we're suffering now for things that happened in the universities 50 and 100 years ago. And sometimes, in Germany, 150 years ago. So that's good. But also it's like, there's, like you're saying, more people just need to say, you know what? No, no.
Right, exactly. No, this is no. You're right.
You cannot put a litter box in the bathroom at the school where my kids go. The answer is no. If a boy goes into the girls' bathroom, the answer is no. I don't need to get fancy about it. I don't need to give you 6 points of peer-reviewed studies. The answer is no, right? I'm just going to stand in the way and say, use that one or go somewhere else. And so there is a place for average Joe, for the carpenter, for the electrician, for the stay-at-home mom to, it's like, I don't have the credentials that you people say gets me into the conversation, but here's my input in the conversation. No. And I appreciate that you're speaking in that language is what I'm trying to say. So anyway, that was a long roundabout way of saying it. Thank you for breaking this down to, to common people speak. But that is what I'm wondering, and what I want this whole podcast is a disciple making effort, right? So if we're going to make disciples, we need to be able to represent Christ in the world in which he's placed us. He determined the time and boundaries of our dwelling, according to Acts 17. The whole Esther thing, we were born for such a time as this. Yeah. He decided that we would be here right now. Right. So when we have gaslit and insanitized, that's the wrong word for it. We've insanified, whatever, an entire culture and a generation.
Yes.
What do we need to do as Christians to prepare to make disciples in the next generation? Because it's not just run-of-the-mill hostility against Christianity. We can look at history and get trained for that really easily. Not well, it might not be easy to do, but it's easy to understand. This seems new to me. So how are there baseline texts of the Bible that we should be really boned up on, or, biblical principles that we can carry into the world? How do you engage in a mentally ill ministry context?
It is a big question. And I'm hoping I can do it some justice. I may not.
We'll just get the conversation started.
Sure. I do believe we are in the last days. And that's why I do believe a lot of this is happening, because things need to move according to all, end times literature in the Bible. Certain things need to be prepared for these things to happen. And I think that is a lot of what is going down. We know and you're the pastor here. I'm not the Bible expert, but when it talks about God is going to grant a great delusion.
Yeah.
And if you recognize what a delusional disorder is, and that's where a lot of people talk, oh, you're delusional, but they don't really understand what that is. A delusion is when you have a fixed false belief.
A fixed false belief.
Yes. That it's a false belief. It's a lie that is fixed. And interestingly, if you look at all of the diagnoses in the diagnostic manual, there are many of them. I don't know how many, but there's a lot.
It's a big book.
It's very big. Really, from my experience, the one disorder that is untreatable is a delusional disorder.
Really?
I did my doctoral internship at a state hospital. So I was working with the sickest of the sick. And we can medicate schizophrenia, we can medicate depression, we can work through trauma. There's all these disorders that we have psychological tools and techniques and therapies for that we can treat. I worked with this one individual who had just a delusional disorder. I'm not going to get into what the delusion was, but actually a couple, now I think about it. They cannot be treated. Medication does not treat that. And you can't talk somebody out of a delusion. And so if you recognize that God is going to allow a great delusion to possibly, what is the whole verse, that it could possibly even
lead astray the elect. Yeah. And in 2 Thessalonians 2, the great delusion is, to your point, what sets the stage for the man of lawlessness, also known as Antichrist. Okay. Yeah.
Thank God you know the Bible better than I do, but that's exactly what I was talking about. I do believe that is what is going on, because you can't speak logic into any of this.
That's interesting. I've heard that about like borderline personality disorder. It's
that's my specialty.
Can't do a thing with it.
Oh no, I treat it all the time. I have many success stories with that.
We've got a couple around here that I think about that people are like, yeah, this guy's borderline personality disorder. People say, here's in the expert literature on this that I saw, I don't know how expert it was, but they were the books I got my hands on. It said, here's what you do with people with borderline personality disorder. Protect yourself, because you can't fix them. And I've seen God just like heal a couple of people up, which is beautiful, but that wasn't exactly a clinical solution. That was just the Holy Spirit intervening on a regenerate believer. But you're actually saying this now about
there are treatments out there that are highly effective for that. But let me qualify what I mean by this. Psychological disorders are different than personality disorders. Okay. So psychological disorders are everything from, attention deficit disorder to bipolar disorder to schizophrenia to major depression to social phobia, all of those. And back in the day, it was called Axis 1. So they were the mental disorders that we say are treatable. Delusional disorder is there. Personality disorders are a dysfunctional personality. And while there are treatments for most of them, and many of them, can get better, and actually many of them get better across time, especially borderline personality, they can mature out of it. That's a personality. It's like a psychopath. A psychopath cannot be treated. A psychopath is got no conscience, no empathy, that cannot be treated. Personality disorders are kind of a different phenomenon. But if we're talking about like that Axis 1 mental disorder, a delusional disorder. And again, people may disagree with me, but from, all of my years of working, that delusion is so fixed, medication can't alter it. Logical thinking can't alter it.
Wow. And so then Second Thessalonians 2 is just from your perspective, you're seeing this as just that in mass. So that becomes the norm.
I think that that is a piece of what is going on here. I think, again, you operate, and this is where for me, and again, because I've never been political until recently, I do see how COVID with the fear really, fear causes people to not think. That way you can indoctrinate, and that way you can feed the delusion. And I think through, especially all of the sexual perversions that are going on now, I think a lot of that is also a function of online pornography.
Oh yeah,
You got to
yeah.
understand, once the internet came around and you can get pornography in a heartbeat, that if you're watching that, there's such a spirit of perversion that has infiltrated our entire culture. So you throw in this delusion that there is no truth, you throw in this spirit of perversion, you throw in psychopathic predators that want to rule the entire earth, and their goal is to basically control everybody and shut you down. You will own nothing and like it. It is leading us up to the time for Jesus' return. Things have to get really bad before he comes back.
Sure. My dad said something once that it was more casual conversation, but the profundity of what he said, I think just keeps growing in the number of layers I see this being true on. I asked him one time when I was like 21, 22, I think we had our first kid on the way. And I said, Dad, is the world actually worse now than when I was a kid? Or am I just like noticing it more because, I'm an adult and I'm responsible for a family now and stuff like that. And he said, probably a little bit of both. But his take on it was, he said the real turning point was in the mid 90s, the mid to late 90s. The internet comes online and porn explodes, and Bill Clinton, because he said when Bill Clinton came out with the Lewinsky thing and said, yes, I had this type of contact with Lewinsky, but that wasn't sex. That right. was listening audience. This is going to get graphic here for a second.
Right.
He said that was oral sex. That wasn't sex. And he said, right. My dad said when he redefined that shifted the morality of a culture, and it normalized. What it did was it took the fringes of what used to be private, taboo. In some cases, you go beyond certain practices, and it's shameful and harmful and things like that. And he said that brought that all to the center and said, oh, okay, so I'm not really breaking the moral code, because like it or not, the president does have moral authority, and there's nothing you can do about that, right? So it's a position of power. So he said, yeah, when that redefinition happened and internet porn came online, kablooey, and everybody's shameful and harmful proclivities got normalized, and now it's like here we are, what, 30 years later, 25 years later, and now they're not even hiding it anymore. Now they're legislating it.
And you're also throw Hollywood into the mix. I mean, what I'm seeing now with my patients, again, we're a little X-rated here. What I'm hearing frequently from my, late teen, young adult patients is the BDSM stuff.
Yeah.
Choking, the spanking, and just how all of this has become so normalized. And again,
50 Shades of Grey, right?
I was just going to say it's rooted, I think, in a lot of that. But also, I think they are trying to normalize pedophilia as another sexual orientation. We already know that the UN has come out and said that it's okay for adults to have sex with children, and that's really what they want, is really their long-term goal.
Yeah, and I gotta wonder, and I don't think the spiritual and the psychological are separate here. I think they're the same. The same thing with two different manifestations.
Kind of psychological you're looking at.
Well, I mean, like to normalize your own sin, right? So like to say, here's what I want to do. And so I will make this okay in the political sphere and the legislative sphere. I'll make this okay in the moral and the spiritual sphere. It's because the men love the darkness, right? When the light shines in the darkness doesn't comprehend it. It's got this kind of repelling effect there. And so I'm sure that there's a number of titles for the psychological affect that this is, where you take something that is harmful and normalize it just so that you feel okay at somebody else's expense. You mentioned psychopathy earlier. That's probably it, right? And then spiritually, this makes perfect sense. It's idolatry, right? This is what gets people sacrificing their children in Canaan or now. And so it's all running along the same lines, right? But there is, so here's where I'm going with this. My question is, with something like like delusional disorder? Would you call it? Okay. Well, something like delusional disorder, there may be no treatment for it. You can't persuade somebody to give up a firm false belief. What if you change what they love? What would a heart change work for would that make progress in therapy there? Or is it just a broken brain?
I think a lot of it is a broken brain, but I do think we know that Jesus can take a heart of stone and turn it to a heart of flesh. And we know that he can transform anything. He
We
is a
see it, don't
miracle. Oh my gosh, you have no idea. And so I do believe that is the only answer. And that's why, it is interesting. Why did God choose to use that word, a great delusion? When we have become, and I've got to come up with what the word is so psychologically driven in our culture. Because, it doesn't really, it's kind of like the work and the research that's been done on pedophiles, for example. They have done lots of trials of trying to change an attraction from a child to an adult. They've done aversive therapy. They've done things of like trying to change that heart, trying to change the lusts of the flesh, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It needs to be a radical come to Jesus experience, I believe.
Yeah, because we can't change what people love, can we? We would love which is frustrating. It's like,
change what I love. Are you kidding me? What the Lord is for, I can't do that.
yeah, boy, dependency in Christian counseling, huh? Yeah. Well, listen, I've taken up an hour of your time, which I told you is about what it was going to take. What I want to get into from here. So I'm going to bait the hook here, and maybe I can convince you to come on with me another time. What I want to get into here is how we can psychologically protect children from predators. How do we teach our kids, when you hear this, when you hear that, that's not safe, that kind of thing. I kind of want to do a training session on that. So I'm going to shoot you an email later, and we'll see if we can have our schedules sync up. It took a while just to get this conversation, just because you and I are both globetrotting all over the place. But exactly. Anyway, but I really appreciate your time, first off, but more than that, your investment into the kingdom of God and the avenue with which you're engaging this. And I'm really glad that the Lord's using you the way that he has. I'm glad that you've risen to be a voice of such prominence in the circles that I'm running in, because we need to be equipped for the work that we're doing. And there's an old saying, right? Life is the hardest teacher because she gives you the test first and you don't get the answers until afterwards. And that's,
I like that. I've never heard that.
Well, that's where we're at. And so it's like, pastors, counselors, and just Christians who take disciple making seriously, we are in a context that we do not understand. And so voices like yours are very, very helpful. And I've gained a lot from it. So thank you for taking some time to, talk to us about that.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. It was fun.
Hungry for Wisdom is a ministry of Grace and Truth Community in West Richland, Washington. You can find out more about us on our app, social media, or at graceandtruthcommunity.com. We love him because he first loved us.